So I'm going to press record for the final little presentation session here for English 4 Module 3. The slides and PowerPoints are available online. If not, do contact me. And we've in the morning, in the first session, we looked at The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We looked at the much later set in the 20s, and then we looked at set in the 30s, written in the 60s, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I'm also going to now look at another book that remembers the 30s, as you can see from this little illustration from an illustrated copy of Remains of the Day in Darlington Hall here, and it's Miss Kenton, the housekeeper. And you can see in the background, Mr. Stevens, the butler, the slave or servant to the master of Darlington Hall. And this must be going back to when it was Lord Darlington, the dignity of the aristocratic breed. And Kazuo Ishiguro is, of course, Japanese by birth, and therefore, in his examination of empire, society, colonialism, post-colonialism, and this sort of master-slave relationship at the center of this, as well as a suppressed love story, which the narrator would never ever own up to, not until the very last second. He obviously comes from one of the evil empires of that period, the empires that weren't like our empires. We were the good empires. They were the evil ones, the Yellow Peril, the Japanese Empire, that is. And of course, the nasty King Leopold from Heart of Darkness, the Belgian Empire, and obviously the Third Reich, the Nazi Empire as well, because they did the bad things, not us, honest gov. Not strictly true, obviously, never would be, an oversimplification. The Remains of the Day seems to be a sort of fin de siècle, I haven't written that here, end of an era type story, which I've touched on, I think, in English too, just a little bit with fantasy. I think that you have an end of an era, end of an age type film. It's called fin de siècle, end of a century piece, and it is quite literally, but it's the end of an era here, and it's the sort of decline of the British Empire, perhaps at its point of apex. The reading that you would have looked through in first session is the prologue, where it's a diary entry marked to Darlington Hall. It's July 1956, which is at the time of the Suez Crisis, where the British Empire de facto hands over power to the American Empire because it asks it to withdraw from the Suez, and it has to respond because it can't actually act without the backing of American money, and so American politics wields all the power, and the British are humbled. And so this seems to be one of the contexts of it. And then through his diaries and his memory, through a technique of flashbacks in a sort of in media res plot or flashback plot, we look back to the interbellum period between the wars, and mostly this focuses on, as well as the Boer War and periods in the 19th century, it focuses on very much on the run-up to the Second World War and a policy of appeasement of the Third Reich and Chancellor Hitler. It touches on the anti-Semitism within Britain at the time, which was then obviously projected onto other evil empires, but it's the center of some of Stevens's recollections. You can see here from the picture is the goings on in the Great Hall in the house, and the house becomes sort of like a microcosm for the entire empire, and they have this gathering where they try and flesh out the future of Europe, and the American in the film version, they're conflated into one man. Faraday is both the diplomat and the new owner of Darlington Hall come back. That's not the case in the book, but the American talks about the politics of the real and a new type of politics, as opposed to the old aristocratic politics of the British Empire, run by the aristocrats, who are also trying to do deals with the Nazis, basically, at the same time. So there is a central love story in this book, but it's resisted by the narrator all the way through. He doesn't let it turn into a romance plot and is in denial of it the whole way through, even though we know from what he tells us and his slips that he clearly is in love with Miss Kenton and that he is going on a journey, because there's a journey through Britain at the end of it, in Faraday's borrowed motor car, the Bentley. Faraday says, "I'll give you money for the gas," in some sort of act of financial support, rather like America sort of propping up the British Empire. And he, under the pretense yet again of hiring Miss Kenton, actually goes after the romance plot, which is denied the whole way through. But we also have what is very strong throughout is this central male relationship, perhaps that we can look at, that exists between Caraway and Gatsby, maybe, Marlowe and Kurtz, maybe, that brings in questions of who is the master and who is the slave, Crusoe and Friday, obviously. Stevens is a butler, symbolic of the British Empire, and he's sort of he is like a slave, as he needs to put aside any of his own personal interests, and he willingly sups up the mythology, the willing denial, a bit like Baldwin talks about in Another Country as well, where he loves to understand these stories. There's one story of a tiger getting into a dining room in India that his father repeats again and again and again, and then the butler gets a 12-bore shotgun and goes in and blows the tiger's head off, and then comes in and everything continues as normal. This sort of master-slave relationship at the center is compared to Caliban and Prospero in The Tempest, and Crusoe and Friday, and it puts forward the idea that the British Empire is sort of kind of based on slavery at home, of the subjugation of one class to another for the myth of the British Empire. It's written in 89. It's what we'd call, I've written up there as well, in that sense it's post-colonial. It voices and readdresses views about colonialism and what were the driving forces behind it and the motives. Obviously, it presents a very, very different view of British involvement in the Second World War and with the colonies beforehand. There's a subplot in it where his brother is killed, and he's killed in the Boer War whilst they are setting up concentration camps. But again, everybody seems to be in denial, in willing denial of what's going on. Stevens tells the story though like a sort of a diary with a series of flashbacks, but he's a supernally unreliable internal first-person narrator. His memory's selective, and then he lets slip, or he just doesn't remember at all, or he changes his story entirely to undermine his own narrative. And through these sort of series of flashbacks, sometimes replayed because they're wrong, or re-remembered again but in a different way, we get a sort of a kind of a view beneath the facade constantly of what's going on. So we seem to know, there's a subtext, we as readers seem to know more than any of the characters in the book do. He sets off in this car, in this Bentley, to try and go after his lost love, Miss Kenton, and it turns into a sort of journey quest where he sort of follows this guidebook, Wonders of Britain, and heads off into this sort of rural wilderness. So even the sort of the genre of travel writing and a journey narrative seems to be in here as well. Lovely illustrations here from This is from the Folio Society's illustrated version of this book. What are the subjects and themes in Remains of the Day? Memory is unreliable, and the idea of memory and the fact that objective reality might not exist, and that everything could be that there could be many versions of truth and many versions of reality is one of the particular interests of postmodern literature. It's very postmodern. So we sort of select information to suit what we need. All knowledge is contingent, and there's an unreliable reconstruction of story into plot, and we can see that happening the whole way through, because there's a sort of postmodern self-awareness of metatext or metafiction. So this sort of gives us this idea that there's lots of truths, or truths have been hidden, or there are competing truths in the story of the sort of shift of empires. And for the British, many would probably have grown up believing that that Britain sort of sacrificed itself and its empire, standing alone against the evil empire, the Dark Lurid, perhaps from fantasy. But this myth, it doesn't stand up at all, particularly when examined with at any greater degree at all. It looks at this central relationship, the master-slave relationship, that's sort of kind of the model for colonization and empire. And it started at home, just like the plantations in Ireland are then exported to the West Indies and the Americas to grow cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Also, the model of the great houses of the aristocracy and the master and the slave, from Downton, from Darlington Hall, is also exported as a model to the rest of the empire. And it's a myth that, of course, to some degree, it seems as if the slaves, the servants themselves, perhaps cling on to even more strongly, making them quite tragic figures. The aristocrats are allowed to openly speak about things and to mock and undermine them, but the servants, the slaves in this case as well, to a degree, because they sell their labor and they sell themselves into service, seem to cling on to those myths of service, of loyalty, of dignity, even more strongly. And as I've written there as well, these sort of myths probably, not probably, definitely sort of hide and are never openly stated, but are alluded to or implied, those of anti-Semitism, of collusion with the Nazis, and the idea that that we're a good empire and they're an evil empire. This very simplistic, romantic, gothic sort of good versus evil plot that's still then extended into fantasy genres, into science fiction genres. This simplification, this symbolic good versus evil, is also collapses here very clearly. Oh, don't know what that's doing up at the top there. I don't know. So it's metafiction. What does that mean? It means fiction that's aware of the fact that it's fiction. It's a story that knows very much that it's telling a story itself. There are diaries involved in this. There's a fragmented narrative. Stuff is left out, and then we go back to it again, and then it's different. And no, hang on a minute, I got that wrong. Also, called an intercalated narrative. It's very clear to us that Stevens, as our protagonist and narrator, tells us what he wants us to hear, or what he wants to hear, but potentially, because as a diary, it also could be for himself. Then he admits to his own memory and recollection being accurate. He sets himself up as unreliable. And so we get the subtext, the thing that we know that the characters in the fiction don't know, which is that he's fooling himself, and we have a kind of a better guess at what the truth is than Stevens does himself. Also, as metafiction, there are books within it. And we've seen quite a lot of books in books. If you remember The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there's a very strong opening tradition of sort of books within books. Here we have Mrs. Simpson's Wonders of Britain, which is Stevens's go-to book. This is a scene from the illustrated version where he climbs up onto this hill, having discovered a wonder of Britain, though he often describes it as a wilderness and a journey into the otherness and the unknown. So he goes on his own voyage, like a fantastic voyage, like Gulliver, like all those people exploring new worlds, but he does it in Britain as a slave in one of the great houses. And so it becomes a kind of journey quest or travel narrative. On top of that, he also has the Twice a Week or More book that features in the book, where he learns how to banter with the American, because he doesn't seem to be able to understand ironic or double meaning in conversation at all. He's so hung up on the myth, taking something exactly for what it is supposed to be: dignity, service, being racist, that he can't understand playfulness or jokes, witticisms, he calls them. I wonder how much time. We're up to sort of half time on that as well, so I'm going to keep this pretty quick, but I will read this. Even as England has to accommodate itself to the rise of America as an imperial power, Stevens, after having served Lord Darlington for 35 years, has to adjust himself to an American master, Faraday, who's bought Darlington Hall because he wanted a genuine grand old English house and a genuine old-fashioned English butler. So rather like almost like Gatsby, how he wants to take on the sort of the mores, the accoutrements of the old money. He comes in as new money and wants to keep on the butler in the house. As Stevens reminisces during his cross-country trip that we've seen above, we learn more than Stevens is willing to reveal, either to himself or to the reader also potentially being himself that he's not admitting stuff to, about the tragedy of his misguided devotion to Lord Darlington, who is part of the plan to appease the Nazis. While critics have praised Ishigura's masterful control of tone and narrative strategies, we kind of touched on that, this multiplicity of how it's told, which make this a bleak and therefore all the more shocking discovery possible. They've also noticed that Stevens' self-abnegation or cancellation, denial in the service of his master reverberates with larger implications about British politics, culture, and society. It's this aspect of the novel I wish to examine more closely, exemplified by Lord Darlington and his butler. They duplicate very precisely England's relationship to its colonies. It's my contention that Stevens' private tragedy is precipitated by what Albert Memmi, in his seminal study, The Colonizer and the Colonizer, terms the cruel hoax by which the colonizer or master ensures that the servant exists only as a function of the needs of the colonizer, i.e., be transformed into a pure colonized. So let's unpack that somewhat. That was a bit thick. Lord Darlington is disgraced for colluding with the Nazis. Stevens stands by him to the last, unquestioningly, even though he must know, but he refuses to admit to himself that he knows. And it's set up here. I've put this article in there as well, particularly if you're interested in post-colonialism. Maybe one for you, Ulda. This idea that he's become, his only function is to serve his master. He's become a monkey, he's described as a dancing monkey and a buffoon. He's made a mockery of, and it's quite brutal. There's a particular scene where he denies all knowledge of everything 3 times when asked, rather like Peter denying Jesus in the Bible, and he's shown up by developments to be perhaps the greatest loser in all this. So it's a tremendous book. I would warmly recommend going away and having a look at Remains of the Day. I don't think the film version gets this as well as possibly it could, but it's still worth watching. Hour and 40 minutes. What can you go wrong? It's also got Anthony Hopkins in it with his beautiful Welsh accent there. Can't do an Anthony Hopkins at all. So let's leave the remains of the day, which is made into a joke in Family Guy. If anybody, you can probably find that as well, because remains and romaines, as in the type of lettuce. But there's a quite classic little Family Guy scene which sort of joshes about this. And let's have a little look-see-doos on 20 minutes here. James Baldwin, Another Country. And we've had a lot of Baldwin already trying to get these issues of identity and race in America, and this idea of sort of the white man and the black man, which we touched on with Heart of Darkness and Jungle Book, and how the white man doesn't even know who the black man is. He only knows the myth of the black man, and for the white man in America to escape this trap, he's going to have to face up with himself as the monster, which is kind of what we pointed to Heart of Darkness might be doing, and is certainly explored in James Baldwin's Another Country. I don't think anybody's actually chosen to read this, but I'm going to touch on it, and then we're going to move on to some movements in art and literature before we go on to our writing phase. What is it? It's potentially postmodern, and I'll go on to that, in voicing lots of multiple characters and stories and giving voices to black homosexuals and bisexuals, and and it's written through the time of obviously the sexual revolution, and it's a realism, as in social realism, because it paints a very clear picture of a time and a place and people going through distressing, difficult situations. But it's often described as engaged realism because it's quite impassioned. He's never sort of detached entirely. It's not just describing what there is without any authorial intervention whatsoever. It's definitely and strongly autobiographical, as that we should have looked at in English too, hopefully. But similar to definitely to Kill a Mockingbird in that respect, that it draws very strongly on real experiences for its sense of time and place, and even character and story. And that strong sense of time and place, which is often characteristic of a Bildungsroman, something we've just been doing in English too, diaries and coming of age stories. It's also got a very strong jazz and blues setting and motifs internal to it. Music comes through quite strongly, lyrics are quoted at certain points. And Rufus, the main character as well, is a jazz musician. And he lives a horrendous life of sexual slavery, potentially. And if you've read that already, you'll know that he starts off as the protagonist in chapter 1 and then dies at the end of it. So we've got yet another story that really we're not even sure who the protagonist might be. Stevens is our protagonist in Remains of the Day, but he seems to be such an anti-hero that he's, the extreme anti-hero. He's the most frustrating person on earth who can't even be honest to himself. Here, Rufus is also similarly willing to live in denial and in sexual slavery, pretty much, which I'll go into in more detail by going around having sex with white men and black men and all sorts of sort of sexual taboos being dealt with as subject. But then it's his best friend Vivaldo and his sister Ida who are left as potentially protagonists in the aftermath, perhaps Eric as well, of Rufus's death. It's a sort of Bildungsroman of sorts. It has multiple characters. And it has a third-person limited narrator, though it's a limited narrator who certainly seems emotionally connected to his characters. The themes, which we can maybe tie to Kill a Mockingbird and to Great Gatsby as well, very strongly, as the alienation of the other in America, and another country in this sense points to the fact that they don't even really belong. There is no sense of belonging, because if you remember from that, the black man lives under very real threat of, if he makes a mistake, he dies. He still dies, and we already see in To Kill a Mockingbird, in Harper Lee's drama, how that is very real for Tom Robinson, who obviously is then tried in front of a jury of 12 men and convicted of a crime he couldn't have committed. Beyond just that idea of alienation and of otherness and of complete disempowerment, there's also as Baldwin often includes, there's this idea of sexuality as a base for that power relationship, the myth of the black man's sexuality, which seems to tarnish him just in the way that slaves initially were separated, children taken from their mothers because they were not seen as somehow inhuman and therefore not capable of loving relationships. And the myth of a black man's sexuality seems to still play into this initial myth of them being Africans being cannibals, of them being primitive and savage. And Rufus tends to go from man to woman, white man, offering himself up in acts of prostitution, because he's in some form of sort of sexual slavery, only understanding that he can get power in his pathetic life by having sexual power over whites. And just like the self-denial of Remains of the Day, one of the striking aspects of Baldwin's portrayal of America in the 60s, 50s, and 60s is that everybody seems to be living in some form of self-denial or blissful ignorance. It's not blissful ignorance, it's horrendously non-blissful ignorance, in the way that Stevens was painfully unable to admit to himself even the simplest of truths. Baldwin plays upon the fact that most of his characters live in dream worlds where they are not prepared to actually confront the obvious conflicts in their lives at individual, societal level, or with nature, or even with God. So they all exist in some sort of what I could describe as solipsism. The world that they see and know is the only truth and reality. Interesting, there's a lot of black homosexuality going on here as well. And sexual diversity itself seems to make this quite sort of modern, though I'm not 100% sure how we can categorize this at all. Came up to 30 minutes now, so I'm just going to have a look at, I don't think anybody's read Another Country. We've looked at Baldwin. We've got some potential to men. I Am Not Your Negro is a great documentary to go and see. We'll come back to that later. We'll touch on it at least, and we're going to have a look at our journey to modernity and beyond. We started off with that Mexican muralism there. We talked about Wiggy McWigface, Wiggins. We'll go Wiggins. Sir Isaac Newt on there, The Age of Reason, Locke the Empiricist, and this sort of mechanical view of the world that really transformed Zavest from a sort of superstitious backwater, the real Gothic, into this colonial empire, but one that, much like Robinson Crusoe, found it very easy to rationalize the role of master and dominance, or even like Gulliver in his satire seemed unable to understand, at least in the beginning, the shortcomings of his own society, though by the end Gulliver is convinced of that humans are rather like Hobbes' sort of savage yahoos compared to the altruistic society of the Houyhnhnm, who also set up a master-slave dichotomy. We then looked at the rather angelic face of Percy Bysshe Shelley there, and talked about Romanticism, Gothicism, idealism, aestheticism, all parts of this movement with this idea of nature, a return to nature, perhaps the medieval, a movement back to warriors and courtly romance, to the poet, the philosopher king, the hero, and emotion. So you could see how it was probably quite a middle class rebellion, to be quite honest. Percy was certainly not much exactly strapped for cash at all. What happens after Romanticism? We looked at sort of a lot of Romanticism. What begins also, we talked about with Jane Eyre that there was Romanticism contra Realism, beginnings of Realism, and Realism really comes in as a rejection of Romanticism. Again, these are sort of interwoven sort of currents and trends in society and culture. But it's pretty much France after the 1848 revolution, which is another go at redoing the 1789 revolution. And realism is a movement in art. You can see here the Stonebreakers on one side, and it's this sort of very realistic, accurate representation of ordinary, everyday lives and subjects of the simplest things, and they get inspiration from empiricism. It's called mimesis. We talked about mimetics and trying to just basically mirror or copy, mimic life itself. And it's very heavily influenced by sort of Darwin, Atticus Finch theories of sort of natural selection. And the truly great sort of writers are Zola, who wrote a 20 novel cycle of the longest books known to humankind. Balzac, Flaubert, Madame Bovary, which is a fantastic book if you haven't read that. What is important about them is they are naturalistic. They oppose everything we've learnt about tight plots, closed structures. They tend to be open-ended. They are not plot-focused. They look at character and description. And that description, the description of realism, is the description of what's objectively seen in front of you. So there's an almost entire absence of figurative language, of metaphor, of simile, of one thing meaning another. So we can see very strongly in To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, that the symbolism of the songbird, the doubling of the albino, and the pitch black Tom Robinson, whose name also seems to be the same as Robinson Crusoe's. Hello, boop, boop, boop. There's a lot of symbolism and figurative representation in it, which is absolutely not realistic whatsoever. And the thing to know about realism, we sort of looked how it appears. It's sort of still, you can still talk about realism today as well, things which are just trying to depict nature as it is. You could see Ken Loach in his films as being, social realism. They just try to hold up a camera to reality. They'll often use non-actors in their films to try and give that realistic sense. But modernism, which came after it, and which we're going to talk about next, was a rejection of what they saw as bourgeois realism, because just representing stuff was not enough. Not after concentration camps and the First World War. There was an inability to express what was going on, and that led to the next movement. 33 minutes. We'll be stopping soon in a few minutes, so I'm just going to take you through here and then set you free, which makes to Ezra Pound's call for make it new, modernism. Modernism, you'll see from some of the pictures included, Matisse, Picasso, etc., Munch, the Norwegian. There was an experimentation of forms and expressions against the traditional modes, the traditional modes being mimesis, trying to represent nature as best you can, whether it was through the scientific revolution, through giving realistic depictions, or trying to organize nature to a far more romantic view, which still gave a pretty real representation to realism, which was almost sort of, highly realistic. All of a sudden, we get this complete break where people might give abstract representation. If we go from there and go straight back up to that cover of The Great Gatsby, and we see Daisy Buchanan's eyes, mouth, and a tear, This is not realistic representation. Sure. We'll go back in there as well. So, as I've already touched on, really, it's a sort of response to industrialization, urbanization, technology, and the horrors culminating in the trenches in World War One, and the mustard gas, and the trauma and the death. Modernism is often, we can think about movements and philosophy and thought, and we've already touched on Locke's tabula rasa, this idea that maybe humans are a blank sheet and that society could be made new again if we can only access this sort of raw primal material. This can be then combined with ideas like Jung's collective unconscious, that underneath all of this, there's a world of dreams, of psyche, and that there's a collective psyche that can somehow be tapped into. And so the journey of the artist, the modern artist, became sort of a journey into the individual, into the dream unconscious. Another important philosopher that would then be, getting something over there, would be Nietzsche and his will to power. Yeah, is that BS now or later? You'd have to respond to talk to me if you want to, because we're on camera as well. You might think all of it's BS, which you could technically as well, because it's just linguistic representation. Anyway, let's get through to the end of this. I'm not sure what you mean by that. That just seems to be text wall abuse. I like the terminology though. Joyce and Woolf and the famous books of the modernist movement are Ulysses, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse. I can't stand. Maybe you mean that's BS. I can't stand this kind of stuff personally. It brings out stream of consciousness writing, where you've got this immediacy, this accessing of this individual psyche. Modernism sort of tends to believe that great art is difficult and should be hard to read. And boy, most of it is super hard to read. Not Gatsby, thankfully, but if you go to Woolf and Joyce, you'll know exactly what I mean. If you read the poetry of T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats, you'll understand exactly what I mean. And the Scream here by Munch is this sort of suffering and um, alienation and isolation that is often related to modernism. Great artists live their art and they suffer for their art. Great art means great suffering. This is exactly the opposite of, say, pop culture and Andy Warhol in the 1960s, where art is playful. And so modernism is the time of ideologies and the idea that there is one single truth that can be accessed. It's a universal truth that's underlying everything. And so there is a single ideology that can solve everything, whether it's Marxism, whether it's fascism. These are called grand narratives that are rejected later. This kind of thinking is called structuralism. And it's the idea that you can reduce existence to universally recognizable units and building blocks. It's all based on Saussurean linguistics, which we don't have to go into, but the idea is that there's a key to existence, and it might be tapped into in this moment of individual dreamlike truth. If you were to actually put a modernist soundtrack to The Great Gatsby, then you'd use Arnold Schoenberg, which is what's called dissonant 12-tone music, which rejects all traditional harmonies. It built music like a sort of sequence and note out of sort of 12 note scale, which was totally different to anything that had been used before. Schoenberg, this kind of music is noticeable for being the beginning of movies and horror movies, particularly because it's quite an unsettling type of music. And I think if you listen to Schoenberg or go and listen to Verklärte Nacht or something by him, you'll understand immediately what I mean, that it's got this unsettling, alienating feeling that is then used in horror pictures later. Also typical of, so mimesis, art trying to represent what you see in front of you, seems no longer relevant. And so you've got these sort of other movements, which are expressionism, cubism, surrealism, Dada. Here we've got sort of Picasso's cubism, again, not representing reality through what you see on the surface, but some sort of structural pattern underneath that seems to make sense. Right, I'm probably getting to the end of what we can listen to here at this moment. So I'm just going to quickly think about postmodernism, because I'm going to touch on this next week. And then postmodernism, because I've already been mentioning it, rejects modernism and says, why is everything? There's no one single truth. Art doesn't have to be difficult. It's about interaction and play. And there are lots of different ways of understanding stuff. Postmodernism, it's self-aware, playful, it's self-referential, it uses metafiction, it doesn't take itself seriously, it knowingly messes around with format and genre. It doesn't like grand narratives or single truths. It sees these sort of ideologies of modernism as being Eurocentric and incomplete. It thinks that truth is multiple, plural, relative, contingent, that any universalist truths or reductionist truths are completely false or specious. It asks questions like, is there really an objective reality at all? And maybe virtual worlds are just as real as what we think is objective empirical reality. So that gives us all these hubba jubba. This is your BS, Moana. You've got structuralism, post-structuralism. You can reduce the world to codes from which you can understand it. Post-structuralism, you can't do that. Modernism and postmodernism, colonialism, post-colonialism. There's even metamodernism and postmodernism, which we'll touch on next time. Okay, so that's a view of art and literature and the major sort of movements or eras within it as well, which we can refer to. And I've touched on all the way through as I've asked questions of what is this as we've gone through literature. I'm now going to invite you to go for a break, because I think you probably need it after that. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, YouTubers. We're going to be going into our final tasks after this of writing and presenting.